The Kethrani High Council had a saying, passed down through 11 generations of expansion. Patience is the currency of conquest. They believed it the way other species believed in gravity. So when they issued their ultimatum to the human system of Calder's Reach, they did the math, the way they always did the math, and the math told them they had time. 11 days, they calculated. 11 days before any meaningful human response could be organized, fueled, and launched. Plenty of time to consolidate the blockade. Plenty of time to finish arguing about who would get credit for the acquisition. They got 11 minutes instead. This is the story of how a council of 11 high-ranking Kethrani officials sat in a chamber orbiting a dying star and watched several centuries of assumptions about a species called humanity collapse in real time. It is a story about the difference between what you expect from a young civilization and what you actually get when that civilization has spent its entire history being told no by the universe and learning, again and again, to say no right back. It starts, as these things often do, with contempt. The Kethrani Dominion was old, not ancient in the way of the vanished builder races, whose ruins littered half the galaxy, but old enough. Old enough to have swallowed 41 star systems in the last 3 centuries alone, each one absorbed with the same bureaucratic efficiency, the same velvet-gloved ultimatum, the same quiet erasure of whatever the system's inhabitants had called themselves before the Dominion arrived to rename them subjects. Calder's Reach was supposed to be 42. It was a modest system. 3 inhabited planets, a scattering of orbital stations, a shipyard that the Dominion's intelligence division rated as adequate but unremarkable. Humanity had settled it 200 years earlier, part of the slow diaspora that had scattered their species across a widening bubble of space, following what their own histories called the Long Winter, a century of climate collapse and resource wars back on the homeworld that had, according to Kethrani analysts, laughed, the species economically exhausted and militarily conservative. That was the word the intelligence briefing used. Conservative. It appeared 11 times in the report that Council Administrator Vesic Thal read aloud to the assembled High Council on the morning the ultimatum was drafted. Vesic was a narrow, silver-scaled Kethrani, with a kind of voice that made junior officials want to apologize for existing, and he read the report the way he read everything, with the smooth satisfaction of a being who had never once in his long career been wrong about anything that mattered. Their fleet, Vesic said, consists of 43 vessels of note, the largest classified as light cruisers by their own designation standards, which, as we know, tend toward the theatrical. Their shipyards at Calder's Reach have not laid a new keel in 6 years. Their standing military has been reduced by successive budget cycles to what their own Senate debates openly refer to as a skeleton force. Their economy is agricultural and industrial, not military. There is no evidence of a reserve fleet, a hidden shipbuilding program, or any capacity to surge production beyond current levels. He set the report down. They will protest. They will perhaps even fire on our forward pickets in some symbolic gesture of defiance. And then, within perhaps 11 days, once their council chambers have finished performing outrage for their own citizens, they will accept terms. Councilor Praxa Orn, oldest of the 11 and least inclined to speak without purpose, asked the only question that mattered. 11 days is a precise number for a species you claim not to understand. 11 days, Vesic said, is generous. It accounts for their communication lag between outer colonies, their legislative process, and a margin for what our behavioral models call collective denial. In practice, we expect capitulation closer to day 7. Praxa said nothing further. It was not her way to argue with numbers she had not personally verified. This would, in time, become the single greatest regret of her 400-year career. The ultimatum went out on the Dominion's own terms, because it always did. A fleet of 18 Kethrani warships took position at the edge of Calder's Reach's outer system, close enough to be seen by every civilian telescope in the system, far enough to claim, with a straight face, that this was a diplomatic gesture and not an act of war. The message that accompanied them was translated into the local human dialect by an algorithm that had never once needed correcting. It said, in essence, what it always said: submit to Dominion administration. Surrender your fleet assets and shipyards. Accept a Dominion garrison. Do this within a reasonable interval, and your civilian population will be spared disruption. Resist, and you'll be shown why resistance has never once succeeded against the Dominion in 300 years. The message was sent at 0600 System Time, Calder's Reach Standard. Humanity's response arrived at 0611. It did not arrive as a message. Quote, Rear Admiral Josephine Alvarez had been awake for 6 hours before the Kethrani fleet even crossed the outer picket line, because the sensor net at Calder's Reach had picked up their deceleration burn 19 hours earlier, and 19 hours was by the standards of Alvarez's career an almost luxurious amount of warning. She did not consider herself a patient woman. She considered herself an efficient one, which was a distinction the Dominion's intelligence division had apparently never bothered to research. Alvarez had spent the last 4 years as the officer responsible for something the civilian government of Calder's Reach did not advertise, and the Dominion spies had, evidently, never found. It had a file designation so boring that nobody who saw it in a budget line item ever asked a follow-up question. It was called the Reserve Logistics and Readiness Framework, and it was, in practice, the single most dangerous piece of infrastructure that humanity had built since leaving its homeworld. The idea behind it was old. Back to the long winter itself, back to 100 years of humans learning, planet-side, in the mud and the ash, that the difference between a civilization that survives and a civilization that doesn't is not the size of its standing forces. It is the speed at which it can convert its entire productive capacity into force when force becomes necessary, and the discipline to keep that capacity hidden, maintained, and ready during the long, boring decades when it is not. The lesson had been paid for in a currency of staggering cost. Entire coastal cities lost to rising water while relief convoys were still being organized. Famine, spreading through regions that could have been fed if the grain reserves had been positioned 3 months earlier, instead of 3 months too late. An entire generation of humans who grew up understanding in their bones that hesitation kills, that hoping the crisis will resolve itself is how you lose everything, and that the only real defense against catastrophe is to have already built the response before you need it. They carried that lesson with them when they left Earth. They carried it to every colony, every outpost, every fragile toehold scattered across a hostile galaxy that had made it very clear, over and over, that it did not care whether humanity survived. At Calder's Reach, that lesson had a name. It was called Cold Forge. Cold Forge was not a fleet, not in any sense the Kethrani Intelligence Division would have recognized as a fleet. It was a system. It was 41 merchant haulers retrofitted with modular weapons cradles that could be bolted into place in under 4 hours. It was 3 decommissioned shipyards that had never actually stopped building. They had simply stopped building anything that showed up on an open manifest. It was 600,000 tons of prefabricated hull segments, sitting in orbital storage, disguised as agricultural equipment, on every customs record the Dominion spies had ever pulled. It was a reserve of 42,000 trained personnel, veterans and reservists both, who worked ordinary civilian jobs on ordinary days and who had every single one of them run the same activation drill 4 times a year for over a decade. It was a lesson that said, never again will we be caught building the lifeboat after the ship starts sinking. Admiral Alvarez had run the numbers on the Dominion fleet the moment its deceleration signature hit the sensor net. 18 warships, mixed cruiser and escort classes, decent shielding, unremarkable weapons profiles, no evidence of anything resembling the kind of standoff bombardment capability that would make a defense genuinely difficult. She had run harder numbers, more times, against theoretical fleets twice that size, because the entire purpose of Cold Forge was to never be surprised by the question of whether it would work. It had always been a question of when it would be tested, not if. The Dominion ultimatum arrived at 0600. Alvarez had given the activation order at 0602, the moment the message finished translating, because she did not need to wait for a committee to tell her what an armed foreign fleet parked at the edge of her system's shipping lanes actually meant. That was, in fact, the entire point of Cold Forge. It existed precisely so that nobody would ever again have to wait for a committee. 11 minutes. That was how long it took for the first wave of Cold Forge assets to reach weapons-ready status and begin moving to intercept. 11 minutes for pre-positioned crews to reach their retrofitted haulers. 11 minutes for the modular weapons cradles stored fully assembled in orbital warehouses for exactly this purpose, to be mated to hulls that had been sitting quietly in civilian reserve for years. 11 minutes for 42,000 humans who had drilled this exact sequence more times than most of them could count to stop being farmers and freight pilots and dock workers and start being, again, precisely what their species had always been underneath the paperwork. A civilization that does not wait to be ready. Back in Kethrani space, the High Council was still in session. They had not even finished the procedural portion of the meeting where they debated which subordinate administrator would be assigned to manage the new colony's transition paperwork. Councillor Drennick Vosh, the youngest of the 11, and by far the most eager to demonstrate his usefulness, was in the middle of proposing a resource extraction quota when the communications officer entered the chamber without being summoned. This was, in Kethrani protocol, a serious breach. Nobody entered the High Council chamber uninvited. "Forgive the interruption," the officer said, and her voice had a strange flat quality that experienced council members would later describe as the sound of someone trying very hard not to sound as frightened as she felt. "Fleet Command requests immediate council attention. Contact has been made at Calder's Reach." Besic Thal, still mid-sentence about extraction quotas, waved a hand with the mild irritation of a being asked to acknowledge a minor inconvenience. Contact was expected. "The humans will posture. Relay the specifics through the standard channel. There is no need to. Counselor." The officer's voice did not rise, but something in it cut through the chamber anyway. "Our fleet is currently engaged. Casualties are being reported." The chamber went very quiet. It was the kind of silence that Praxa Orn in her 400 years had only heard a handful of times before. Always in the moment just before a piece of received wisdom turned out to be catastrophically wrong. "Casualties," Vesic repeated, as though the word were in a language he did not quite speak. The ultimatum was delivered at 0600 their time. "What is the current time at Calder's Reach?" 0622, the officer said. "Counselor, sir, it has been 22 minutes. Nobody in the chamber said anything for a long moment. 22 minutes. Not 11 days. Not even 11 hours. 22 minutes, and somewhere in the back of that silence the number that would later become infamous throughout every intelligence division in Dominion space was already forming. The number that would end up in 100 revised threat assessments and 1,000 grim jokes among human fleet crews for years afterward. 11 minutes to weapons ready. The Council did not know that number yet. They only knew that a fleet they had rated as unremarkable, a civilization they had filed under conservative, had somehow managed to put a defensive response into contact with their forces in less time than it took the High Council to finish an agenda item about mining rights. "Put the feed on the main display," Praxa Orn said. It was the first thing she had said in almost an hour. Now, what appeared on the display did not at first look like the total collapse of 3 centuries of strategic doctrine. It looked at first almost boring. A cluster of ships, 41 of them by the fleet officer's rapid count, converging on the Dominion's blockade line from 3 separate vectors at once, moving with a coordination that suggested none of it was improvised. "Those are merchant hull profiles," Drennick Vosh said, frowning. He had, in fact, personally reviewed the intelligence assessment of Calder's Reach's shipping fleet only the week before. "Those are cargo haulers." "What are cargo haulers doing at a battle line?" Nobody answered him because the sensor logs were already updating, and the merchant hull profiles were rapidly ceasing to look like merchant hulls at all. Weapons emplacements that should not have existed on those ships were reading hot across every scan band. Shield harmonics that had no business being generated by a civilian freight vessel were flaring to life across the formation. "They retrofitted their entire merchant marine," Praxa said slowly, and there was something in her old voice that the rest of the council would spend a great deal of time afterward trying not to remember, because it sounded uncomfortably like admiration. "They built a war fleet and hid it as cargo shipping. How long would that take? How long would that cost?" It does not matter how long it took, Vesak snapped, though his composure was fraying visibly now, a thin crack running through decades of professional certainty. Recall the order to disengage. We will withdraw the blockade line, reassess, and counselor. The communications officer's voice was flat again, that same strange flatness. Fleet Command reports the blockade line has already been broken. 4 ships lost, 9 damaged, and the human formation is not pursuing. They have taken position and are holding. Holding, Drennick repeated. Holding. Where? At the edge of Calder's Reach's own system boundary, counselor. Exactly where our fleet was previously positioned. There was another silence. This one was worse than the first, because this one carried the specific shape of a realization crystallizing across 11 very old, very experienced minds all at the same moment. The humans had not driven the Dominion fleet away out of panic. They had pushed it back to precisely the boundary line that international, or rather interstellar convention recognized as the edge of a sovereign system's territory. It was not a rout. It was not chaos. It was a correction, executed with the calm precision of a species that had known exactly what it intended to do the moment the ultimatum finished translating, and had simply gone and done it. "Get me Fleet Command," Vesak said, and for the first time in the recorded history of Council sessions, his voice cracked on the word. Admiral Alvarez, 700 light-years away, was not thinking about the Kethrani High Council at all in that moment. She was thinking about Petty Officer Reyes, who had taken a hull breach on the modular weapons cradle of the freighter Concepcion during the opening exchange, and who was, according to the medical update scrolling across her tactical display, expected to survive but would lose partial function in one arm. She was thinking about the fact that 4 Dominion ships had been destroyed in the engagement, and that meant somewhere between 200 and 400 Kethrani crew members were probably dead, and that she had ordered that, and that it did not feel like triumph. It felt like a bill finally being paid on an account that had been accruing interest for longer than she had been alive. She was thinking mostly about how tired she was and how the drill had worked after 10 years of drilling, exactly the way it was supposed to. "Status," she said to the officer at the secondary command console aboard the Concepcion, which had, 4 hours earlier, been hauling grain to the outer colonies and was now, officially, the flagship of a defensive action against a foreign power. "Formation holding at the boundary. Admiral, enemy fleet is withdrawn to extreme range. No further aggressive maneuvers detected. Cold Forge reserve assets standing at readiness level 2, awaiting your order. Hold it too," Alvarez said. "Do not advance past the boundary. We are not the ones starting a war today." "Understood, Admiral." She looked at the tactical plot for a long moment, at the neat cluster of retrofitted freighters and converted haulers, holding a line that 4 hours earlier, nobody outside a very small circle of cleared personnel had known existed as a military asset at all. "Get me a channel to the civilian government," she said, "and get me everything we have on the Dominion fleet's command structure. If they want to talk, I want to know exactly who I'm talking to." Back in the High Council chamber, that conversation was already becoming necessary, because the fleet commander at Calder's Reach, a grizzled and thoroughly humiliated officer named Tarek Vons, had opened a channel requesting immediate instruction. And the instruction he received amounted to a council in complete disarray, trying to construct a version of events in which their doctrine had not simply failed in front of an audience. "It is a trick," Vesak insisted, pacing now, which was itself a violation of decorum that nobody bothered to comment on. "A single engagement proves nothing. They surged whatever reserve they had. It cannot be sustained. Their economy is not built for prolonged conflict. Our own assessment confirmed this." "Our own assessment," Praxis said very quietly, "also confirmed that they had no reserve fleet at all. Perhaps, Administrator, it is time to consider that our assessment was constructed entirely from what the humans wished us to see." Vesak turned on her, and for a moment something ugly moved behind his composed expression. The look of a being watching his career and his certainty disintegrate at the exact same moment. "You would have us believe an agricultural colony deliberately deceived Dominion intelligence for years." "I would have us believe," Praxis said, "that a species which survived a century of collapse on its own world, learned something the rest of us have had the luxury of forgetting. That preparation made in silence costs nothing until the day it costs everything. Nobody had an answer for that. The chamber sat with it, the weight of it settling over the 11 counselors like a physical thing. And outside the chamber, unheard by any of them, the machinery of a much larger reckoning was already beginning to turn. Because Admiral Alvarez had not simply repelled a blockade. She had, in the 4 hours since the ultimatum arrived, already dispatched a full data package to the human systems bordering Calder's reach, the ones that had spent years watching the Dominion's slow, patient absorption of neighboring territories with a mixture of dread and denial. The package contained sensor logs of the engagement, full technical specifications of the Dominion fleet gathered during the brief exchange, and a simple, unadorned message that would end up quoted in more human history texts than almost any other communication of the era. They came expecting 11 days, the message read. It took us 11 minutes. Whatever you have hidden, now is the time to stop hiding it. The message reached 41 other human systems within 9 hours. 14 of them had their own version of Cold Forge, their own quiet, decades-long insurance policy, built from the same hard lesson of the long winter, and every single one of them began, quietly and without fanfare, to activate. This was the part of the story that the Kethrani High Council did not yet understand, sitting in their chamber, arguing about whether one engagement constituted a pattern. They were not dealing with one system that had gotten lucky. They were dealing with a species that had, independently and across dozens of colonies separated by years of travel time, arrived at the exact same conclusion about how to survive in a universe that did not care about them, and had built the exact same kind of silent, patient, terrifying insurance against the day someone came to collect what they had not earned. 3 days after the engagement at Calder's Reach, the Dominion Fleet Commander Tarek Vons received a transmission he had not requested and could not decline. It came from a ship, a single ship, according to his sensors, though the sensor readings themselves seemed almost reluctant to commit to that classification, because the vessel in question did not match any known human hull profile in the Dominion's considerable database. And its mass readings alone suggested something that should not have been buildable by a civilization the Dominion's own intelligence division had rated as economically constrained. It was called the Josephine Alvarez, though of course the ship had not existed under that name 4 days earlier. It had existed, on paper, as a component of the very same Cold Forge reserve. A keel laid down in secret 9 years prior in one of the decommissioned shipyards, built slowly, in silence, module by module, disguised in every official record as an agricultural processing station. It had been completed and quietly commissioned 18 months before the Dominion's ultimatum arrived, and it had spent that 18 months doing nothing more dramatic than sitting in a hidden orbital slip, running system checks, waiting for a day its builders had hoped would never come. It was not the largest ship in existence. The Dominion had built bigger, in raw tonnage, but it did not need to be the largest. It needed only to be exactly large enough and exactly ready enough to arrive at the boundary of Calder's Reach's system, alone, and hold position directly in front of the entire remaining Dominion blockade fleet without so much as a shield flicker of hesitation. "This is Admiral Josephine Alvarez, Calder's Reach Defense Command," came the transmission, translated with a flatness the algorithm had not been built to convey properly, though the tone underneath it needed no translation at all. "You are currently occupying space within contested territorial boundary of a system under active defense. You have 4 hours to withdraw your remaining fleet beyond the boundary marker transmitted with this message. This is not a negotiation. This is a courtesy. Extended once." Fleet Commander Tarek Vons, who had spent 3 days trying to construct a report that would not end his career, stared at the message for a long moment before he did something that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. He complied. He did not consult the High Council first. He simply gave the order, because every instinct he had left, every scrap of professional judgment surviving the wreckage of the last 3 days, told him that whatever was actually happening at Calder's Reach was no longer a matter that could be managed through the ordinary channels of Dominion patience. The High Council, informed after the fact, convened in an emergency session that lasted, this time considerably longer than the one that had produced the original ultimatum. He withdrew without authorization, Vosh said, outraged in the particular way of a being discovering that outrage is the only tool he has left. That is a court-martial offense, Praxa said, because he understood something the rest of this council has spent 3 days refusing to understand. We miscalculated, not by a small margin, not by an error that can be corrected with a revised intelligence report and a stiffer ultimatum. We miscalculated by an order of magnitude that suggests everything we believed about this species was constructed from what they permitted us to see. You speak as though they orchestrated all of this, Vesic said, though the fire that had animated his certainty 3 days earlier had burned down to something smaller and more brittle, as though an entire species conspired for decades to deceive us specifically. Not specifically, Praxis said. That is what you are failing to grasp, Administrator. They did not build this for us. They built it because they learned, at unimaginable cost on their own world, that nobody is coming to help, and the only defense against catastrophe is one you have already built before you need it. We were never the target of their preparation. We were simply the first ones, foolish enough to test it. There was a long silence. What do we do? Drenik asked, and for the first time his voice carried none of its earlier eagerness. It carried something closer to fear. The answer arrived before the council could construct one of its own, because 4 hours after Tarek Vonz's withdrawal, a second transmission reached the High Council chamber directly, bypassing the Fleet Command relay entirely. Mitabai Sten, which was itself a demonstration of a communications intrusion capability that the Dominion's own security division would spend the next several years trying, without success, to fully understand. The transmission carried an image, not a written message. It showed a star chart, the Dominion's own border with human space, annotated with markers that took the Council a horrified moment to interpret correctly. 41 markers, one for each human system that had, in the days since Calder's Reach, activated its own version of whatever Cold Forge had been. 41 systems, each one apparently possessing its own hidden reserve fleet, its own silent shipyards, its own decades of patient preparation that the Dominion's intelligence apparatus had entirely failed to detect across an area of space the Dominion had, until 4 days earlier, considered thoroughly mapped and thoroughly understood. Beneath the star chart was a single line of translated text. We did not want this. We are prepared for it anyway. The choice of what happens next belongs to you. The chamber sat in silence with that message for a long time. It was Praxa who finally spoke, and what she said would, in the fullness of time, become the closest thing the Kethrani Dominion had to an official account of its own catastrophic misjudgment, quoted for generations afterward as a warning against the specific, seductive comfort of underestimating a species that has already survived the worst thing it can imagine. We built our doctrine on a single assumption, she said, that readiness scales with visible strength, that a fleet you cannot see is a fleet that does not exist. We measured this species by their shipyards, their budgets, their public postures, and we mistook their restraint for weakness, because restraint was not a language our doctrine had ever needed to translate. We were not defeated by a larger fleet, counselors. We were defeated by a civilization that understood, better than we ever have, the true cost of hesitation. They did not build their strength to conquer. They built it because they once discovered at unbearable cost what it means to need it and not have it. And now we have discovered what it means to face it without ever having seen it coming. Nobody in the chamber disputed her. The negotiations that followed, conducted over the next several months, were unlike any the Dominion had ever entered into, with the species it had originally classified as a target for absorption. There was no ultimatum from the Dominion side this time. There was, instead, a careful methodical process of humanity dictating terms from a position that nobody in the chamber any longer pretended to misunderstand. The terms were not vindictive. This surprised the Dominion delegation more than almost anything else about the entire affair, because vindictiveness was a language they understood, and its absence felt, to several of them, more unsettling than an outright demand for reparations would have been. Humanity's terms were simple. A formal, permanent renunciation of any claim on Calder's Reach or any bordering human system. a binding agreement verified by neutral third-party observers, establishing a demilitarized boundary zone between Dominion and human space, and an accounting delivered through proper diplomatic and eventually judicial channels of the specific officials responsible for authorizing the original ultimatum. Vesik Thal was, in the end, the one held most directly accountable, not through any human intervention, but through the Dominion's own internal process, once the full scope of the miscalculation became impossible to hide from the wider council structure above the High Council itself. He was removed from his position, and the report that documented the reasons for his removal became, within Dominion administrative circles, a kind of grim object lesson, referenced for years afterward whenever a junior official was tempted to describe any species as conservative, unremarkable, or economically constrained, without first asking what that species might have built in the silence of the years nobody bothered to watch closely. Admiral Alvarez did not attend the final signing of the boundary agreement. She sent a junior officer in her place, because she had by that point already returned to the quieter and less glamorous work of quietly rebuilding Coldforge's reserves to account for the assets expended during the engagement, restocking the modular weapons cradles, running the drills again. Because the entire philosophy that had saved her system in the first place held that the work of readiness never actually finishes. It simply pauses, briefly, before beginning again. She did, however, attend a much smaller ceremony 6 weeks after the engagement, at a cemetery on Calder's Reach's second moon, where the names of the crew, lost aboard the Concepcion and its sister ships, were added to a memorial wall that already carried names from a century of smaller tragedies. She stood there for a long time, in front of Petty Officer Reyes' family, and she did not give a speech, because there was nothing about a speech that would have made the arm Reyes had lost grow back, or the 2 crew members who had not survived the breach come home. What she said instead, quietly, to Reyes's mother, was something that would eventually make its way, secondhand and imperfectly remembered, into the historical record of the era, cited by later scholars as one of the clearest distillations of the philosophy that had built Cold Forge in the first place. "We didn't build this to win a war," she said. "We built it so we would never again have to watch our own people die, waiting for help that wasn't coming. Your son didn't die because we were unprepared. He was hurt because we were exactly as prepared as we needed to be. On the day it mattered, instead of 11 days too late." It was not a comforting thing to say, entirely. But it was true, and Reyes's mother, who had lived through enough of her own family's history to understand precisely what an 11-day delay might have cost instead, understood it in the particular way that only someone who has been failed by slowness before can understand the terrible mathematics of speed. The galaxy's political landscape did not shift overnight. These things rarely do, no matter how dramatic the single incident that triggers them. But over the following years, a pattern became undeniable across every major power with a border touching human space. Ultimatums stopped being issued casually. Intelligence assessments of human systems stopped using words like conservative and unremarkable, and started, instead, to include a specific cautionary annotation that eventually became standard across multiple galactic powers. A phrase that entered a dozen different languages in barely translated form and came to mean, roughly, the same thing every time it was used. Assume hidden capacity. Assume readiness exceeds visible indicators. Assume the response, if it comes, will not wait for you to finish deciding it is necessary. Historians, human and otherwise, would spend decades afterward debating exactly how many systems had built their own version of Cold Forge, and exactly how deep that silent, patient culture of preparation ran through the whole scattered diaspora of humanity's colonies. The honest answer, arrived at slowly, and with a certain grudging respect from analysts who had once dismissed the entire species as a minor and fragile power, was that nobody, including most humans themselves, knew the full scope of it. It had never been designed as a single coordinated project. It had grown, independently system by system, out of the same hard-won cultural memory, the same century-old lesson that had been paid for in famine and flood and cities lost to rising water, that hope is not a plan, and that a civilization which waits to be ready is a civilization that has already decided it does not particularly mind losing. Fleet Commander Tarek Vons, for his part, was never court-martialed. In the strange, quiet aftermath of the whole affair, his decision to withdraw without authorization came to be regarded, within Dominion military circles, as the single correct judgment made by anyone in a position of authority during the entire crisis. He retired 2 years later, and in his memoirs, published under a title that translated roughly to 11 minutes, he wrote a passage that many considered the truest thing ever said by a Dominion officer about the events at Calder's Reach. "We spent 3 centuries," he wrote, "learning how to measure the strength the species chooses to show us. We never once considered what we might find in the strength the species chooses to hide, and why, a species that has already survived, losing everything, might have very good reasons never to show it at all until the exact moment it becomes necessary. We called them conservative. We should have called them patient. We should have asked ourselves what a species does with all that patience, in all that silence, across all those years we never bothered to watch closely enough." Praxa Orn lived a long time after the events at Calder's Reach, long enough to see the boundary agreement hold, unbroken, for the remainder of her life. She never again sat on a council that treated intelligence assessments as settled fact rather than as the beginning of a much harder question. In her later years, she took to lecturing at the Dominion's own military academy, and the lecture she gave most often to class after class of young officers who had grown up hearing about Calder's Reach as a cautionary legend rather than a lived catastrophe, always ended the same way. "You will be tempted," she told them every single time, "to measure a civilization by what it shows you. Do not measure it, instead, by what it has survived. And ask yourself honestly what any people who have survived the worst thing imaginable might have quietly built in the years since, in case the worst thing ever comes looking for them again. The galaxy is full of species who show you everything they have. Be far more afraid of the ones who don't." At Calder's Reach itself, a small marker was eventually placed at the exact boundary line where the Dominion blockade fleet had first been pushed back, a simple plaque, unremarkable in size that most passing ships would never even notice. It did not commemorate a victory in the triumphant sense that later, less careful historians sometimes assumed. It commemorated something quieter and, in its way, more powerful. It marked the place where a species that had spent a century learning what happens when help arrives too late finally proved, to itself, as much as to anyone watching, that it had learned the lesson completely. The inscription was brief. It read simply, "They expected 11 days." It is worth remembering, always, how long readiness actually takes to build, and how short a time it takes to matter. Somewhere, in the vast, indifferent dark between the stars, that lesson kept traveling outward, carried in the wary new caution of every fleet that now thought twice before issuing an ultimatum to a system it had not bothered to watch closely enough. And on Calder's Reach, in the quiet years that followed, the drills continued, 4 times a year, exactly as they always had, because the people who had built Cold Forge understood something that no ultimatum, no council, and no century of contempt had ever managed to unlearn out of them. The work of being ready never really finishes. It only waits, quietly for the day it matters again. If this story hit you the way it hit us, putting it together, do us a favor and drop a like before you go. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. Sass, let us know in the comments what your favorite moment was, whether it was the 11 minutes, the star chart, or Praxa's final warning to her own people. Subscribe and ring that notification bell if you want more stories in this vein, because there are plenty more where humanity gets badly underestimated and pays that particular debt back in full. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars. Until